I showed up to my sister's wedding only to find a stranger sitting in my seat. But when the officiant called my name, everything I thought I knew about that day shifted. Hi, I'm Hannah, and I've spent most of my adult life feeling like the second choice in my family. My younger sister Leah was always the golden one. Prettier, funnier, more charming at every gathering. When her wedding invitation arrived, I wasn't surprised to see my name listed without a +1 while our cousins got them. Still, I bought a nice dress and showed up early, telling myself it was enough just to be there for her. The church was beautiful, all white roses and soft light filtering through stained glass. I walked down the aisle looking for my seat, clutching my small gift bag. The usher checked his list twice when I told him my name, then pointed vaguely toward the back rows. I felt my stomach tighten, but I smiled anyway. Weddings were stressful, I reminded myself. Maybe they'd just made a small mistake with the seating chart. When I reached the row marked with my name, a woman in a lavender dress was already sitting there. She had a camera around her neck and was chatting with the people beside her. I stood there awkwardly, checking my invitation again to make sure I hadn't misread it. The usher came over, looking flustered, and explained that they'd needed the seat for the photographer's assistant. He gestured toward some folding chairs they'd set up along the side wall. I felt my face flush hot. I'd driven 4 hours to be here, bought a gift I couldn't really afford, and now I was being shuffled to overflow seating like an afterthought. But I didn't want to make a scene, especially not at Leah's wedding. I took one of the folding chairs, smoothing my dress and trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. From where I sat, I could barely see the altar between people's heads. Architected emotional narrative arc with strategic plot reveals. Good start. Now I need to build the emotional tension, her feeling overlooked, memories of their relationship, the wedding proceeding. Then the surprise when her name is called. I need to keep each paragraph moving forward with new emotions and thoughts. Paragraph 5. She watches the ceremony begin, reflects on their childhood. Paragraph 6. Memories of being second place. Paragraph 7. The ceremony continues. She notices details. Paragraph 8. Emotional moment watching her sister. Paragraph 9. Reflection on their relationship now. Paragraph 10. The officiant begins speaking. Paragraph 11. Her name is called. The turn. Paragraph 12. Her confusion, shock. Paragraph 13. Walking up. Paragraph 14. Understanding what's happening. Paragraph 15. The reading or role. She's being asked to do paragraph 16. Emotional moment with sister. Paragraph 17. Completing the task. Paragraph 18. Sitting back down, processing. Paragraph 19. Reception, aftermath. Paragraph 20. Resolution and reflection. Let me continue, keeping to 70-80 words each. The ceremony started, and I watched Leah walk down the aisle on our father's arm. She looked stunning, of course, her smile bright enough to light the whole church. I felt that familiar mix of pride and sadness I'd carried since we were kids. I was happy for her, truly, but part of me couldn't help wondering if she'd even noticed my name missing from the family row. Maybe she'd been too busy with final preparations to care where I ended up. Growing up, I'd been the responsible one. Straight A's, scholarships, the daughter who never caused problems. Leah had been the one who needed help with homework, who forgot to do her chores, who charmed her way out of consequences. Our parents had always said I was capable enough to handle things on my own. Leah needed more attention, more support, more of everything. I'd learned to take care of myself and not expect much recognition. The vows began, and I found myself genuinely moved despite my hurt feelings. Leah's fiancé, Marcus, was kind and steady. Exactly the type of person I'd hoped she'd find. He looked at her like she was the only person in the room. I dabbed at my eyes with a tissue, grateful that at least she'd found someone who would put her first. Maybe that was enough, even if our family dynamics would never change. I thought about the last time Leah and I had really talked, 3 months ago, when she'd called to finalize wedding details. She'd been stressed about the budget, the guest list, the million tiny decisions that go into planning a wedding. I'd offered to help with whatever she needed, but she'd said she had it under control. I'd wondered then if she even wanted me involved beyond just showing up. Our relationship had always been complicated. We'd been close as children, sharing a room and secrets and dreams. But somewhere in high school, a distance had grown between us. She'd found her crowd, her identity, her path. I'd found mine too, but it felt like we were living in parallel rather than together. We loved each other, I knew that, but we didn't really know each other anymore. The officiant, an older woman with kind eyes, was talking about the bonds of family and the people who shape us. I shifted in my uncomfortable folding chair, half listening. Then I heard my name. "Hannah Thompson," the officiant said clearly, her voice carrying through the suddenly quiet church. I froze, my heart hammering. I must have misheard, but people were turning around, looking toward the back where I sat. My hands started shaking. I looked up and saw Leah turn toward me too, her face soft and expectant. The officiant repeated, "Would Hannah please come forward?" I stood on unsteady legs, my mind racing through possibilities. Had I forgotten something? Was I supposed to bring something to the altar? The walk down that aisle felt impossibly long, every eye following my path. When I reached the front, Leah reached out and took my hand. Her eyes were bright with tears, and she squeezed my fingers gently. The officiant smiled at both of us and began to speak again. She explained that Leah had asked for a special moment in the ceremony, something she'd planned specifically for me. My throat tightened. I didn't understand what was happening, but I felt the careful control I'd maintained all day starting to crack. The officiant handed me a folded piece of paper. "Leah has written something she wants you to read," she said softly. I opened it with trembling hands and saw my sister's handwriting, slightly messy but achingly familiar. The first line read, "To my sister Hannah, who taught me what strength looks like." I had to pause, blinking back sudden tears. Leah nodded encouragingly, and I realized this was why she'd needed my seat. I read her words aloud, my voice shaking. She'd written about our childhood, about how I'd always been there for her even when I'd had my own struggles. She thanked me for every time I'd helped her study, every time I'd covered for her with our parents, every time I'd believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. She wrote that she wouldn't be standing here today without the example I'd set. "I know I haven't always shown it," I read, "but you're the person I admire most in this world. I wanted you here, standing beside me in this moment, because nothing about this day would be complete without you." By the end, I wasn't the only one crying. I looked up at Leah, and she pulled me into a tight hug, whispering, "I love you," against my ear. The officiant explained that Leah had wanted me to have a speaking role but had kept it a secret because she knew I'd be nervous. The seat situation had been a misunderstanding with the wedding planner. I was supposed to be in the front row the whole time, not relegated to folding chairs. Leah had only learned about the mix-up moments before walking down the aisle, but had decided to let the ceremony continue as planned. I made my way back to my seat, but this time an usher guided me to the front row, to the space that had always been meant for me. I sat between our aunt and cousin, my heart still racing, the folded paper clutched in my hand. I watched the rest of the ceremony through a blur of grateful tears, seeing my sister differently now, understanding something I'd missed all along. At the reception, Leah found me during the cocktail hour. We stood together by the window, watching the sunset over the venue grounds. "I'm sorry about the seat thing," she said quietly. "I was so angry when I found out." "You must have felt awful." I told her it didn't matter now, that her words had meant more than any seating arrangement ever could. She explained that she'd been planning that moment for months, working with the officiant to find the right way to honor what I meant to her. "I know Mom and Dad always made it seem like I was the one who needed everything," she said. "But you were the one holding everything together. I saw that, even if they didn't. I've always seen that." We hugged again, longer this time, and it felt like something old and wounded was finally beginning to heal. The evening continued with dancing and toasts and cake, but I kept touching the folded paper in my pocket, reminding myself it was real. I'd spent so many years believing I was invisible in my family's story, that my role was to support from the shadows. But Leah had seen me all along. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to show me I'd always had a place at the center, not the edges. When I drove home that night, exhausted but strangely light, I thought about all the assumptions I'd made about my sister and our relationship. I'd convinced myself that her silence meant indifference, that her busy life meant she'd moved on without me. But love doesn't always look like constant attention or perfect gestures. Sometimes it looks like a carefully planned moment, a folded piece of paper, and a sister who remembers everything you thought she'd forgotten. The week after the wedding, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment at the altar. I'd folded Leah's letter carefully and put it in my nightstand drawer, but I didn't need to read it again to remember every word. It had shifted something fundamental in how I saw our family, our history, the story I'd been telling myself for years. I found myself smiling at random moments, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. Leah texted me from her honeymoon in Costa Rica. The message was simple, a photo of her and Marcus on a beach at sunset, and the words, "Wish you were here to see this. Love you, sis." I stared at my phone for a long moment before responding. We'd never been the type of sisters who texted each other regularly or shared casual updates. This felt like a new language we were learning together. I decided to call our mother the following weekend. We talked every few weeks, usually surface-level conversations about weather and work. But this time, I wanted to ask her something I'd never had the courage to ask before. "Mom," I said carefully, "did you know what Leah was planning at the wedding? The part where she called me up?" There was a long pause on the other end. "She told me a few days before," Mom said finally. "She wanted to make sure I'd be okay with it, changing the ceremony order like that." Her voice had a quality I couldn't quite read. Maybe guilt, maybe defensiveness. I asked if she'd been surprised by what Leah had written. Mom sighed, and I heard her setting down what sounded like a coffee cup. "Honestly, Hannah, yes. I didn't realize she felt that way about you." That admission hurt more than I expected. I'd spent my whole childhood being the capable one, the daughter who didn't need reassurance or praise because I seemed to have everything figured out. But I'd needed it just as much as Leah had. I just hadn't known how to ask for it. "I think we missed a lot," Mom continued softly. "Your father and I. We thought we were doing the right thing, letting you be independent. You seemed so strong." I told her I understood, even though part of me didn't. Not completely. We talked for another hour, longer than we'd talked in years. She shared things I'd never heard before. How proud she'd been when I'd gotten my scholarship. How she'd bragged about me to her friends. How she'd always assumed I knew how much they valued me. I'd assumed silence meant indifference. She'd assumed my independence meant I didn't need validation. When Leah and Marcus returned from their honeymoon, she invited me to brunch at their new apartment. I'd never been there before. They'd moved in together just a month before the wedding. The place was small, but bright, filled with unpacked boxes and wedding gifts still in their wrapping. Leah made pancakes while Marcus set the table, and I felt oddly emotional watching them move around each other in their domestic rhythm. Over coffee, Leah asked if I'd talked to Mom. I nodded and told her about our conversation. Leah set down her mug and looked at me seriously. "I spent years being jealous of you," she admitted. "Everyone always said how smart you were, how responsible, how you had it all together. I felt like the screw-up sister who couldn't measure up." I almost laughed at the irony, but it wasn't funny. Not really. We'd both been living in the shadow of the other's perceived perfections, neither of us seeing how the other struggled. Leah explained that she'd started therapy 2 years ago, working through family dynamics and her own self-worth. Her therapist had helped her understand how much she'd relied on me growing up, how much she'd taken for granted. Writing that letter had been part of her process, acknowledging what I'd meant to her. I asked why she'd never told me any of this before the wedding. Leah played with her napkin, folding and unfolding it. "I was ashamed," she said. "I thought if I admitted how much I'd leaned on you, you'd resent me. And maybe part of me worried you'd say you didn't remember it that way, that I'd made it all up in my head." Her vulnerability made my chest ache with recognition. Marcus excused himself to take a work call, leaving us alone at the table. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sound of traffic outside. Leah reached across and took my hand, something she hadn't done since we were kids. "I want us to be close again," she said. "Like before everything got complicated. Is that something you'd want too?" I felt tears prick my eyes and squeezed her hand back. I told her yes, but that I didn't know how to bridge the gap we'd let grow between us. We weren't teenagers anymore sharing a bedroom and secrets. We had separate lives, separate routines, separate worlds. Leah nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we start small," she suggested. "Weekly calls? Or we could try that book club thing you mentioned years ago that I blew off." I smiled, remembering how excited I'd been about that idea. Over the next few weeks, we did start small. Tuesday night phone calls where we talked about everything and nothing. She told me about her job at the marketing firm, the office politics, and creative challenges. I told her about my work at the nonprofit, the clients I worked with, the bureaucracy I navigated. We recommended shows to each other, shared recipes, complained about our parents in ways that felt healing rather than bitter. One evening, Leah called earlier than usual. Her voice was tight, stressed. A project at work had fallen apart, and her boss had blamed her in front of the whole team. She felt humiliated and incompetent, all the old insecurities rising up. I listened as she cried, then told her about a time I'd made a major mistake at my job, how I'd recovered, what I'd learned. She thanked me for not trying to fix it, just for being there. That conversation reminded me of something I'd forgotten, how good it felt to be needed, not just as the capable older sister, but as a person someone trusted with their vulnerability. I'd spent so long being strong that I'd forgotten strength could also mean showing up for someone else's weakness. Leah needed me differently now, and I needed her differently too. We were learning to be equals rather than roles. My father called unexpectedly one Saturday morning. We talked even less than Mom and I did. Our conversations usually filtered through her. He was uncomfortable with emotional topics, preferring facts and logistics. But this time, he said he'd been thinking about the wedding, about Leah's letter. "Your mother and I talked," he began. "We realize we might have gotten some things wrong when you girls were growing up." His voice was gruff but sincere. I didn't know what to say. An apology from my father was unprecedented, even if it was wrapped in cautious language. He continued, explaining that they'd thought they were helping me by letting me be independent, by not hovering the way they had with Leah. They'd seen my competence as evidence they were doing it right. "But we should have told you more often how proud we were," he added quietly. We talked for nearly an hour, another record. I told him I was working on letting go of old resentments, trying to understand everyone had done their best with what they knew. He asked about my job, really asked, wanting details beyond the surface answers I usually gave. When we hung up, I sat on my couch feeling like something fundamental had shifted, like the ground beneath my family had been rearranged into a new configuration. Thanksgiving was different that year. Usually I'd arrive at my parents' house, help Mom with cooking, and feel vaguely invisible while Leah entertained everyone with stories. But this time, when I walked in, Leah immediately pulled me aside to show me the photo album she'd put together. Pictures of us from childhood, some I'd never seen before. We sat on the stairs looking through it, laughing at our terrible haircuts and awkward phases. At dinner, Dad made a toast that surprised everyone. He raised his glass and talked about both his daughters, about how grateful he was for the women we'd become, for how we'd found our way back to each other. He looked directly at me when he said he was proud of the life I'd built, the work I did, the person I was. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand under the table. Later, while washing dishes, Leah and I stood side by side at the sink like we used to when we were kids. "This feels different," she said, echoing my thoughts. I agreed, telling her it felt like we were finally seeing each other clearly instead of through the fog of old assumptions and hurts. She bumped my shoulder with hers, a gesture so familiar and long absent that it made me want to cry. As I drove home that night, I thought about the woman I'd been at Leah's wedding, hurt, feeling invisible, carrying decades of accumulated disappointment. I thought about the folded letter that had changed everything, not because it erased the past, but because it reframed it. Leah had seen me all along, and now I was learning to see her too, not as the golden child, but as a sister who'd been struggling with her own shadows. I pulled the letter out of my nightstand drawer when I got home and read it again in the quiet of my bedroom. The words hadn't changed, but I understood them differently now. This wasn't just about Leah acknowledging me, it was an invitation to rebuild something we'd both thought was lost. And I was finally ready to accept it, to believe I deserved a place in my family's story that wasn't defined by silence or second place. 3 months after Thanksgiving, Leah called me on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. Our Tuesday calls had become sacred, but midweek contact meant something was up. Her voice sounded strained when I answered, carefully controlled in a way I'd learned to recognize. She asked if I could meet her for coffee that evening, somewhere between our apartments. I said yes immediately, already running through possibilities in my mind. We met at a small cafe we'd discovered together the month before, one of those places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Leah was already there when I arrived, sitting in the corner with 2 cups in front of her. She'd ordered my usual without asking, vanilla latte with oat milk. That small gesture of knowing me made my chest warm even as I registered the tension in her shoulders. She waited until I sat down before speaking. "Marcus and I have been talking about starting a family," she said, her hands wrapped tightly around her cup. "We're thinking about trying soon, maybe in the next few months." I felt a rush of emotions, excitement for her, but also something more complicated I couldn't immediately name. I smiled and told her that was wonderful news, watching her face for clues about why this felt like a difficult conversation. Leah nodded, but she wasn't smiling. "I'm terrified," she admitted quietly. "Not about being pregnant or having a baby, but about being a mother, about repeating the same patterns Mom did with us." She looked up at me then, her eyes searching. "What if I have 2 kids and I favor one without realizing it? What if I damage them the way we were damaged?" Her vulnerability cut straight through me. I reached across the table and took her hand. I told her the fact that she was worried about it meant she was already more aware than our mother had been. But I understood her fear because I'd thought about it too, even though I wasn't close to having kids myself. Our family patterns were like grooves worn deep into stone, easy to fall into without conscious effort. Leah squeezed my fingers, her eyes filling with tears. "There's something else," she said, her voice dropping lower. "I want you to be really involved. Not just as an aunt, but as someone my kids know loves them and is there for them. I want them to see us close, to see what sisterhood can look like when it's healthy." She paused, searching for words. "I guess I'm asking if you'd be willing to be that person, even though it might be hard sometimes." The question caught me off guard. I'd assumed I'd be a distant aunt, the one who sent birthday cards and showed up for major holidays. Leah was offering me something different, a central role in her future children's lives, a chance to help shape a new generation without the mistakes of the old one. It felt enormous and sacred and slightly terrifying. I asked her if she was sure she wanted that kind of closeness. "I've never been more sure of anything," Leah said firmly. "You're the best person I know, Hannah. I want my kids to know their Aunt Hannah the way I'm finally getting to know my sister." The certainty in her voice made something in my chest crack open. I told her yes, of course yes, but that we should talk about what that actually meant in practice. We spent the next hour mapping it out, what involvement would look like, how we'd handle disagreements about parenting, what boundaries we'd need to maintain a healthy relationship. Leah pulled out her phone and started taking notes, ever the planner despite her reputation as the spontaneous sister. I watched her organize our conversation into bullet points and felt a surge of affection for how seriously she was taking this. As we talked, I realized this was about more than her future children. Leah was asking me to commit to our relationship in a deeper way, to promise I wouldn't disappear back into my old patterns of distance and self-sufficiency. She was saying she needed me, and she wanted to need me, and that neededness was something to build on rather than avoid. It felt revolutionary after years of believing I was better off alone. Walking to our cars later, Leah linked her arm through mine. The evening air was cool, and the streetlights had just flickered on. "Thank you for not thinking I'm crazy," she said. "Marcus thinks I'm overthinking it, but he didn't grow up the way we did. He doesn't understand how much intention it takes to break cycles. I told her Marcus was lucky to have grown up in a healthy family, but we had something too. We had awareness. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed thinking about tiny humans who didn't exist yet, about being an aunt in a real and present way, about responsibility and love and second chances. I thought about my own future too, about whether I wanted children of my own someday. I'd always assumed I'd be single and career-focused, but Leah's question had opened up possibilities I'd kept carefully closed. I called my therapist the next day and scheduled an extra session. I'd started therapy 6 months ago, finally admitting I needed help processing my family stuff. Dr. Chen listened as I explained Leah's request, the weight of it, the honor and the fear tangled together. She asked me what I was most afraid of, and I realized it was failing Leah, disappointing her, proving I wasn't actually the person she believed I was. Dr. Chen reminded me that Leah wasn't asking for perfection, she was asking for presence. There was a difference between being the sister who had it all together and being the sister who showed up authentically, flaws and all. I'd spent so long performing competence that I'd forgotten how to just be human with the people I loved. This was a chance to practice something different. The following Tuesday, Leah called right on schedule. She sounded lighter than she had at the cafe, almost giddy. She and Marcus had started seriously planning, reading parenting books and looking at their finances. She'd made a Pinterest board of nursery ideas, which she knew was premature but couldn't help herself. I found myself getting excited with her, asking questions, offering thoughts about child development from my nonprofit work. Then Leah asked me something unexpected. Would you consider being their godmother? Not in a religious sense necessarily, but in a if something happens to us sense? My breath caught. That was legal weight, real responsibility, not just the emotional commitment we'd discussed. I asked if Marcus was okay with that, knowing his parents were still very present and capable. Leah said they'd discussed it extensively, and yes, everyone agreed. I told her I needed a few days to think about it, which she understood. This wasn't something to say yes to lightly. If something happened to Leah and Marcus, I'd be responsible for raising their children, for making medical decisions and educational choices, and 1,000 daily acts of love. I'd be choosing to bind my life to theirs in the most permanent way possible. I talked to Mom about it that weekend. I drove to my parents' house and found her in the garden, which was where she did her best thinking. She looked up when I approached, brushing dirt from her gloves. I explained what Leah had asked, expecting her to be hurt that Leah had chosen me over our parents. Instead, Mom smiled in a way that looked almost relieved. That's exactly right, she said, surprising me. You and Leah should be each other's fail-safe. Your father and I won't be around forever, and you girls need to be able to count on each other. She stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. I think it's beautiful that she trusts you that much. And I think you should say yes. Coming from Mom, that endorsement meant more than I'd expected. That evening, I sat on my balcony watching the sunset and imagining different futures. One where I was just Aunt Hannah, present but peripheral. Another where I was Godmother Hannah, legally and emotionally central to children who would call me in the middle of the night and need me at soccer games and graduation. The second future felt bigger and scarier, and somehow more real than anything I'd planned for myself. I texted Leah the next morning. Yes, I'd be honored to be their godmother. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, her response came through. You just made me cry at my desk. I love you so much. I stared at those words, simple and perfect, and felt the last piece of my old identity, the invisible, self-sufficient sister, finally fall away completely. 6 months passed, and Leah called me on a Saturday morning in April. I was at the farmer's market picking up vegetables when my phone rang. Her voice was shaking when I answered, and my heart jumped with worry before she said the words, I'm pregnant. I stopped walking right there in the middle of the crowded market, people flowing around me, and felt tears spring to my eyes. I asked her how far along, and she said 8 weeks, that she'd just come from the doctor. She wanted to tell me first, before our parents, before anyone else. That fact alone made me emotional in a way I hadn't expected. Leah explained that Marcus knew, obviously, but I was the first person she'd called after leaving the clinic. "I needed to hear your voice," she said softly. "I needed to know you were still in this with me." I assured her I was, absolutely, asking her how she felt physically and emotionally. Leah admitted she was scared and excited in equal measure. The morning sickness had already started, mild but persistent. She'd bought 3 different pregnancy books and was overwhelmed by all the information. I found myself smiling at her typical response to uncertainty: research everything until it felt manageable. I offered to come over that afternoon, to just sit with her and let the reality of it sink in together. She said yes, immediately. When I arrived at her apartment, she looked tired but radiant. Marcus hugged me at the door, his eyes bright with barely contained joy. He excused himself to run errands, giving us space. Leah and I curled up on her couch with tea. "Herbal for her now," she noted with a small smile. She pulled out her phone and showed me the ultrasound picture. Just a tiny blob, but somehow already precious and real. We talked about timing, about when she'd tell our parents, about how she'd manage work during the first trimester when fatigue was worst. Leah asked if I thought Mom would be overbearing, and I said probably, but maybe in a different way than we'd experienced growing up. Our parents were older now, more aware of their past mistakes. Still, I suggested we set some gentle boundaries early about unsolicited advice and visits. Leah nodded, making notes on her phone again. Then she looked at me seriously. "I want you at the appointments," she said. "Not all of them, but the big ones. The anatomy scan, maybe some of the later ones. Would that be okay with you?" I felt honored and slightly overwhelmed. That was intimate territory, usually reserved for partners and maybe mothers. She was inviting me into the inner circle of this experience. I told her I'd love that, as long as Marcus was comfortable with it. Leah said they'd discussed it, and he understood how important our relationship was. He had 2 sisters he was close with, so he got it. She also mentioned that his family was excited but lived 3 states away, so they wouldn't be around as much for day-to-day support. That made my role even more significant and necessary. Over the next few weeks, I fell into a new rhythm with Leah. I'd stop by twice a week with ginger tea and saltines for her nausea. We'd sit together while she worked through her pregnancy symptoms, the exhaustion, the food aversions, the emotional swings that left her crying over commercials. I learned to just be present without trying to fix everything, which didn't come naturally to me but felt important. When Leah told our parents at 12 weeks, I was there. We'd planned it as a family dinner at their house. Mom had made pot roast, Dad's favorite. After we ate, Leah pulled out a small wrapped box and handed it to Mom. Inside was a onesie that said, "Grandma's little blessing." Mom gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Dad stood up from the table, his face doing something complicated between joy and tears. Mom hugged Leah first, then Marcus, then turned to me. "Did you know?" she asked, and I nodded. Instead of looking hurt, she smiled. "Good," she said. "I'm glad she has you." That simple statement felt like another piece of healing, Mom acknowledging our bond without resentment. Dad clapped Marcus on the back, then pulled Leah into one of his rare, genuine hugs that lasted longer than his usual quick pats. The evening shifted into planning mode, Mom talking about baby showers and nursery colors, Dad discussing college funds and insurance. I watched Leah navigate their enthusiasm, gently redirecting when they got too intense, accepting their joy without letting it overwhelm her own vision. She'd grown so much in the past year, finding her voice in ways she never had before. I felt proud of her in a way that had nothing to do with comparison. Later, as I helped Mom clean up in the kitchen, she asked me how I was really feeling about all this. I paused, considering. I told her I was genuinely happy, but also aware this would change my relationship with Leah again. Our rebuilt closeness would now include a child, new dynamics, different priorities. Mom nodded thoughtfully, drying a dish slowly. "Change isn't always bad," she said. "Sometimes it's just the next chapter." At Leah's 20-week anatomy scan, I sat beside Marcus in the darkened ultrasound room. The technician moved the wand across Leah's belly, and suddenly there on the screen was a tiny, perfect profile. I watched fingers flex, legs kick, a heart beating steady and strong. The technician asked if they wanted to know the sex, and Leah looked at me before answering. Yes, she said. We do. A girl. They were having a girl. I felt something shift in my chest watching that announcement. A niece. A little girl who would call me Aunt Hannah, who I'd promised to love and protect and show up for. Leah reached for my hand without looking away from the screen, and I squeezed back. Marcus had tears running down his face, unashamed. The technician printed out pictures, and Leah handed me one immediately. For you, she said simply. That night, I put the ultrasound picture on my refrigerator, the first personal photo I'd displayed in my apartment in years. I stood in my kitchen looking at it, thinking about the little girl who would arrive in 4 months, who would change everything about my carefully constructed independent life. I felt scared and excited, ready and unprepared, all of it tangled together in a way that felt exactly right. Leah started nesting at 6 months, organizing and reorganizing the nursery with an intensity that was part hormones, part genuine anxiety. I helped her assemble furniture, sort tiny clothes, debate between different shades of pale yellow for the walls. She'd decided on yellow because she didn't want to lean too hard into pink, wanting her daughter to feel free to be whoever she became. I loved that intention behind every small choice. One afternoon while we painted, Leah asked me about my own future. Did I want kids? Did I want marriage? I'd been so focused on being present for her journey that I hadn't thought much about my own. I told her honestly I didn't know anymore. I'd spent so long assuming I'd be alone that imagining partnership or parenthood felt foreign. But something was shifting, possibilities opening up that had felt closed before. Leah set down her paintbrush and turned to face me fully. You deserve everything you want, Hannah, she said firmly. You spent so long making yourself smaller, needing less, but you're allowed to want more. You're allowed to build whatever life makes you happy. Her words landed in my chest like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples through everything I'd believed about myself. I thought about that conversation for days afterward. I'd defined myself by my independence for so long that I didn't know who I was without it. Being needed by Leah, being part of her daughter's life before she was even born. It was teaching me that connection didn't mean losing myself. It meant finding new parts of myself I'd kept hidden or ignored, parts that wanted to belong and be chosen. At Leah's baby shower, Mom pulled me aside while everyone else played games in the living room. We stood in the kitchen, and she handed me an envelope. Inside was a card with a long letter in her handwriting. She'd written about regrets, about wishes she'd done things differently with me, about how proud she was of the woman I'd become despite her mistakes. She'd written that watching Leah and me rebuild our relationship had taught her something about love and second chances. I folded the letter carefully, my hands shaking slightly. Mom touched my arm gently. I'm not trying to make excuses, she said. I just wanted you to know I see you now. I see how hard you've worked to heal, how generous you've been with your sister. You're going to be an incredible godmother and aunt. That little girl is so lucky. Her voice cracked on the last sentence, and I hugged her. Really hugged her, maybe for the first time in years. Leah went into labor on a Tuesday night in late August, 2 days before her due date. Marcus called me at 11 p.m., his voice tight with controlled panic. They were heading to the hospital, and Leah wanted me there. I threw on clothes, grabbed the bag I'd packed weeks ago for this moment, and drove through empty streets with my heart pounding. Everything felt surreal and hyper-real at once, like I was living in someone else's important life. When I arrived at the hospital, Marcus met me in the lobby. His hair was sticking up from running his hands through it, and he looked young and terrified and determined. He walked me to Leah's room, where she was breathing through a contraction, gripping the bed rail. When it passed, she looked up and saw me. You came, she said, as if there'd been any doubt. I took her other hand, and we fell into the rhythm of labor together. The next 12 hours were a blur of contractions and breathing exercises and cold washcloths. I stayed mostly in the background, letting Marcus be her primary support while I ran for ice chips and timed contractions and called our parents with updates. Mom wanted to come immediately, but Leah had asked her to wait until after the baby arrived. She needed the space to do this her own way, without managing anyone else's anxiety. Around noon, things intensified. Leah had decided against an epidural, wanting to experience everything fully. I watched her work through pain with a strength that awed me, her face determined even when tears streamed down her cheeks. Marcus never left her side, whispering encouragement, breathing with her. I felt privileged to witness this raw, powerful moment of becoming, even from the periphery where I belonged. At 2:47 p.m., my niece entered the world. I heard her cry before I saw her, a strong, indignant wail that made everyone in the room laugh through tears. The nurses placed her on Leah's chest, and I watched my sister's face transform into something I'd never seen before, a fierce, protective love that seemed to rewire her completely. Marcus was sobbing openly, kissing Leah's forehead, touching his daughter's tiny hand with reverent fingers. I stood back, giving them their moment as a new family. But then Leah looked up and motioned me closer. "Come meet her," she said softly. I approached the bed carefully, and Leah shifted the baby so I could see her face, scrunched and red and absolutely perfect. "Hannah, meet Maya Grace," Leah said. "Maya, this is your Aunt Hannah who already loves you so much." I touched her tiny fingers, and my whole heart cracked open. The nurse took Maya to clean her up and do measurements. Marcus followed, taking pictures and FaceTiming his parents. Leah and I were alone for a moment in the quiet after everything. She looked exhausted and elated, her hair stuck to her forehead with sweat. "Thank you for being here," she said. "I couldn't have done this without you." I told her she absolutely could have, but I was grateful she hadn't made me miss it. Our parents arrived an hour later, bearing flowers and balloons and barely contained excitement. Mom cried when she held Maya, whispering things I couldn't hear but could guess at. Apologies and promises and hopes. Dad was uncharacteristically gentle, cradling his granddaughter like she might break, his expression soft in a way I'd rarely seen. I watched them with their first grandchild and felt the family circle expanding in real time. Over the next few days, I visited the hospital during my lunch breaks and after work. I brought Leah real food since she was tired of hospital meals, and we'd sit together while Maya slept in her bassinet. Leah was learning to breastfeed, which was harder than she'd expected, and she'd cry from frustration and hormone crashes. I'd just sit with her through it, passing tissues and reminding her she was doing great, even when it didn't feel like it. When they came home from the hospital, I helped them settle in. Marcus's paternity leave had started, but Leah wanted me around anyway. I stocked their fridge with easy meals, did their laundry, held Maya while Leah showered for the first time in days. It felt natural falling into this support role, not out of obligation but genuine desire to ease their transition into parenthood however I could. Maya was 3 weeks old when I held her for the first time while she was awake and alert. Her dark blue eyes, which would eventually change color, Leah told me, seemed to focus on my face. I talked to her softly, telling her about myself, about the world she'd joined, about how much she was already loved. She made small sounds, and I felt something settle in my chest, a commitment deeper than any I'd made before. Leah started a group text with me, and Marcus called Team Maya. We'd send updates throughout the day, feeding times, diaper counts, tiny milestones like the first real smile or a good nap. Being included in this intimate loop of parenting communication felt significant. I wasn't just extended family checking in occasionally. I was part of the inner circle they trusted with the mundane details that made up Maya's daily existence. One evening when Maya was 6 weeks old, I was holding her while Leah made dinner and Marcus worked late. Maya fell asleep against my chest, her tiny body warm and trusting. Leah looked over from the stove and smiled. "You're a natural," she said. "Have you thought more about your own future?" I had, actually. I'd started dating someone I'd met through work, taking things slow but letting possibilities unfold rather than shutting them down automatically. I told Leah about him, David, who worked with at-risk youth and had kind eyes and didn't seem intimidated by my independence. It was early. Nothing serious yet. But it felt different than past relationships where I'd held back waiting for inevitable disappointment. Leah set down her spoon and came over, looking at me with such genuine happiness. "I'm so glad," she said. "You deserve someone who sees how amazing you are." Her belief in me still felt like a gift I was learning to accept. The christening happened when Maya was 3 months old. Not a religious ceremony exactly, but a gathering where Leah and Marcus officially named me as godmother in front of family and friends. I stood at the front of their living room, packed with people, and made promises I intended to keep: to love Maya unconditionally, to support her parents, to be present through whatever challenges came, to help raise her with intention and awareness. Mom squeezed my hand after the ceremony ended. "I'm proud of you and your sister," she said quietly. "Look at what you've built together." I looked around the room, at Leah laughing with friends, at Marcus bouncing Maya gently, at Dad talking animatedly with David about something, at the life we'd all somehow created from the broken pieces of our past. It wasn't perfect, but it was real and honest, and ours. That night, after everyone left and I helped clean up, Leah walked me to my car. The autumn air was cool, and I could hear crickets in the darkness. She hugged me tightly, Maya asleep in the carrier strapped to her chest. "I never thought we'd get here," she said. "After so many years of distance, I thought maybe we'd just always be polite strangers." I told her I'd thought the same thing, that I'd resigned myself to that version of sisterhood. "But that moment at my wedding," Leah continued, "when I called your name and saw your face, I knew we had a chance to fix this. I knew you wanted it too, even if you'd never have asked for it." She was right. I'd spent so long protecting myself from disappointment that I'd stopped reaching for connection. Her willingness to reach first had changed everything, had given me permission to hope for more than I'd allowed myself. Driving home, I thought about the woman I'd been at Leah's wedding, hurt and invisible, sitting on that folding chair, convinced of my place on the margins. I thought about the letter that had begun rewriting our story, the months of intentional rebuilding, the trust we'd carefully reconstructed. I thought about Maya sleeping peacefully in her nursery, a child who would grow up knowing a different version of family than we had. I thought about my own expanding life, David and the tentative possibility of love, work that felt meaningful, relationships with my parents that were healing slowly but genuinely. I'd spent so many years believing I had to be self-sufficient, that needing people meant weakness. But sitting in Leah's hospital room, holding Maya, being chosen as godmother, all of it had taught me that connection was actually the bravest thing I could do. When I got home, I took out Leah's wedding letter from my nightstand drawer where I still kept it. The paper was worn now from handling, the creases soft. I read it again, her words about strength and admiration and love, and I finally believed them fully without the protective skepticism I'd held for so long. She'd seen me when I thought I was invisible, and I'd learned to see her too, really see her beyond old patterns and assumptions. I put the letter back carefully and pulled out my journal. I wrote about the christening, about promises made and kept, about Maya's small perfect fingers wrapped around mine. I wrote about Leah and our rebuilt sisterhood, about Mom's apology and Dad's gentle pride, about David and the scary, beautiful possibility of letting someone in. I wrote until my hand cramped, trying to capture this moment of transformation, this sense of finally belonging in my own family story instead of watching from the edges where I'd placed myself for so long.